Here we are at the World Conference on Earthquake Engineering in Lisbon. World Conference on Earthquake Engineering is a very big meeting that takes place every 4 years, at which scientists from all over the world present the work that they've been doing on various aspects of earthquake engineering and earthquake risk mitigation. Some 4,000 or 5,000 papers are going to be presented. Lisbon is a very appropriate place for the World Conference on Earthquake Engineering because it's got a big history of earthquake disaster from the 1755 earthquake in particular, a history of rebuilding and a history of acute awareness of the earthquake risk. The river behind us was the source of an immense tsunami which came up the river and washed away large parts of the Lisbon foreshore in 1755. That was followed by a big fire, and overall something like 40,000 people died in Lisbon. A memory which has never been forgotten. It's the worst disaster in a European city that's ever occurred, and a lot has happened here in Lisbon to try and protect the population from risk.
Lisbon, as you know, has a long history of earthquakes, and especially the 1755 earthquake that took place 250 years ago, destroyed the city, and the downtown was rebuilt during the almost 56 years after that. And it was quite interesting because at the time a lot of things really changed in science, in the schools of thought, in philosophy, and so on. So it was a moment of change in the appreciation of the natural hazards and natural disasters. Many new things were developed in relation to the reconstruction of Lisbon, such as measures for seismic resistance using the so-called gaiola. Gaiola is a timber structure that is placed inside masonry walls, and what it really does is to get enough resistance towards lateral loading.
Reconnaissance really perhaps began in Japan in 1891 or 1906 when the Japanese went over and studied what happened in San Francisco, or in their own earthquake in 1891. And since that time, going through the people like Steinbrugge and Bloom, who chased a lot of earthquakes, as they said, in the 50s and 60s, up until almost to today, it's been a lot of very, very heterogeneous data collection with very little good data preservation, which is really, when you contrast it with, for example, as seismologists who have developed consistent data collection for 100 years, on the engineering societal side, very poor. This has been recognized now in the last couple of years, and few years, and there's been now a much more consistent effort to be more consistent, and to collect data on a consistent protocol basis, so to speak, data formats, and also to archive it. One of the things was a lot of data has been collected but not archived. So going forward, what we're seeing now is trying to develop international protocols. It's part of the consistent effort to use the IT world, using tablets, remote sensing, and of course correlating those two. Correlating the ground truth and the remote sensing is a challenge. The remote sensing will improve our efficiency at a certain level of detail. So I think going forward, the real developments are going to be using the IT tools, but really developing the platforms within them for consistent data collection.
I guess the main thing is just how difficult it is to visualize or to see damage. There's buildings in Christchurch where visible damage was almost totally obscured until the building was investigated in detail, and eventually we arrive at demolition. So what appeared to be buildings that were almost undamaged completely are ending up by being destroyed.
The problems are of evaluating, first of all, the hazard, the degree of shaking that might be reasonable to assess the building for, and having done that, the likelihood that the building is going to react in some way that you don't want, given that level of shaking. So there are tremendous uncertainties on both sides of the equation, particularly actually the hazard, I think, but also obviously the vulnerability as well.
Here we're in the Plaza Comercio, which is the heart of the Baixa district. Behind me you can see the streets that were reconstructed after the earthquake in 1755. This area was totally destroyed by the combination of the tsunami and the fires that raged, and the old buildings completely disappeared, and they were rebuilt under a new set of rules governing the urban form, and also using the Gaiola form of construction.
From an engineering point of view, it's very interesting because the Marchese de Pombal was the first to actually build a shaking table on site and build a mock-up of a building as it would have been in his mind, and shows that the building with the timber frame would behave much better than a building made of just rubble, masonry and mortar. And so that convinced the king of the time that he should put money into rebuilding the Baixa as he was suggesting. The other interesting thing is that the Baixa is also one of the earliest cases of actual very careful urban planning together with the construction details.
So behind me is the Baixa area, but to the right, over here, is the castle, and on the slopes of the castle is the Alfama district, which has many buildings which predate the earthquake. They were damaged and then repaired after the earthquake. And that presents a particular problem nowadays for earthquake protection in a city like Lisbon. There are many such cases all over Europe of old masonry buildings which are actually very vulnerable to earthquake ground shaking. And you have the problem of how to upgrade these buildings and make them earthquake resistant without taking them down and rebuilding them. Okay, so here we're in the heart of the Alfama district, and it's an area, as you can see, of very old stone masonry buildings, 4 or 5 stories high. Many of these buildings may even predate the 1755 earthquake, and they constitute a really important problem for protection. But actually it's very difficult to find techniques to strengthen buildings like this. We had a project back in the 90s, in the mid-90s, in which we looked at various ways of strengthening these old masonry buildings. And we were particularly enthusiastic at the time about tie rods that linked the walls at the front and the back to create a kind of box action in the structure. And we showed also that the strengthening doing this kind of work was actually pretty cost effective. But coming back here 15 years later, it seems as if nothing very much has actually happened.
Since then, I think we had 2 major occasions to test our hypothesis that the ties might be the best way forward in strengthening such houses, especially when, as you can see around here, they are such an irregular layout and such irregular connection between one building and the next one. And we saw that a similar urban fabric in the villages and towns in Umbria, but also more recently in L'Aquila, which have been both struck by not very strong earthquake, certainly a much smaller earthquake than the 1755, but yet destructive earthquake. And we have seen that the traditional ties very often have been the most effective mean of avoiding partial or total collapse in these buildings. In fact, what we have also seen both in L'Aquila and in the Umbria market is that where more modern ways of strengthening, such as the use of ring beams at the top under the roof, or the introduction of reinforced concrete slabs instead of the traditional timber floor, have actually increasing substantially the mass of the building, have actually created more problems than have solved.
Doing the wrong thing can in many cases be actually worse than
doing nothing.
Than doing nothing.
Yes.
When we see recent events in countries that have had virtually no effective regulatory process, either in terms of building standards or land use regulation, we simply see the repetition of known failures over and over again, and the consequences of poor practice that are well known to everyone. And this repetition of failure is not going to be stopped by research or by good intentions or by world congresses. We really have to get down to the nitty-gritty of regulatory practice. That is, we have to be able to review plans, inspect buildings, modify land use patterns to reduce risk. Because what we're seeing is that the character of risk in urban areas is in many ways distinctly different from that of rural areas. And we have to consider issues of infrastructure failure, and I think that we begin to see different types of construction, somewhat more sophisticated use of materials and so on. And we have to address these issues in ways that haven't previously been considered. Centers in other developed and developing countries need to come together to focus specifically on the application of knowledge. That is, how do we make what we know count to protect the people that we're concerned about?